Welcome to the Behavior Grooves Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We have conversations with interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life.
We started this podcast to help broaden the discussion on behavioral science in ways that would help people live their lives better or be more productive at work. Our guest today, David Yokum, has been doing that his entire career.
Yeah, David recently moved to Brown University, where he assumed a post as an adjunct professor and has been tasked with establishing and directing a new center that will support applied public policy research with state and local governments. And while doing that, he remains a senior advisor to the lab at D.C., which is in the executive office of the mayor of the District of Columbia. And he's still a partner at Hugo Analytics. Yeah. And then in his spare time, he hosts the podcast at DC, where he explores how to apply the latest scientific findings and methods to improving local government.
Oh my gosh.
He's not very busy.
No. So, of course, we wanted to speak with him, and I think you won't be disappointed.
Definitely not.
Our conversation started off talking about his moves from the White House Social and Behavioral Science team, moving to the lab at DC, and then starting a Center for Behavioral Policy Research at Brown University. Conversation then segued into a discussion on testing in the real world and how that is very different than digital.
Yeah, science is hard.
It is?
Yeah, it's hard, especially field work, which David has focused most of his career on.
Doing experiments in the field is not like a chemistry lab, where you pull the elements off the shelf, heat them up, and watch what happens. Field work involves lots of moving parts with lots and lots and lots and lots of people.
Lots?
Lots and lots and lots and lots of people. And so we discussed the challenge of bringing behavioral science into government.
And we also talked about some of the insights that he's discovered, like his failed replication of Michael Halsworth's tax letter studies.
Oh, poor Michael.
Well, thank goodness he tried it and it worked, and it tried and it worked, and then he tried and it failed. And we know that. We've learned from that.
Well, and Michael will say the same thing when we talked with him. There you go. All right.
David also did the first major police officer body cam study to mapping the rat population in Washington, D.C.
Rat mapping. That was so cool.
It was.
And think about the research of mapping rats. Anyway, you have to listen in order to find out. All right. And then we got into Tim's favorite section of our interview. We talked about the lost art of making a mixed tape.
Wait, you remember? Did you make mixtapes?
I made mixtapes. I loved making mixtapes.
How many did you make?
Millions and millions. No. I don't know. More than 10, less than 200. I don't know. I made mixtapes and they were damn cool.
Okay.
And I put lots of love and heart and soul into every single one. And they were always for somebody else.
Yeah, that was the trouble. Yeah, of course. It starts with a girl.
Yeah, it starts with a girl. Okay, before you settle back and listen in, we wanted to give you an update. Behavioral Grooves is now listened to in over 85 countries, and we have had more people subscribe in the past month to the podcast than we had in the prior year. We wanted to thank you, our listeners, for that. Yay! All the reviews and referrals that you've made are making a difference. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, so as you're sitting back and listening to this podcast in your comfy chair with, say, 2 fingers of single malt scotch nearby, well, it could happen. And you've already written a review or shared it with a friend. Just thank you for helping expand our global community.
Wait. Who the hell has time to sit back in a comfy chair with 2 fingers of single malt scotch and listen to podcasts?
1 finger?
Let's be real here. Let's be real. Look, talk about the reality of what's going on.
Okay, you're driving to work. You're listening to the podcast.
What, not with the scotch, single malt.
No scotch.
Okay,
no scotch. No scotch. And you're planning on what you're trying to fix for dinner tonight. Okay, right? All that's going through your head, but you haven't passed the podcast on to one more curious mind. Please make a mental note. Please make a mental note so that when you get to the office, you could
do that.
Do that. You will.
When I get to the office, I will. So a when and will kind of component. I will send it off to a friend and make a wonderful review.
And with that,
That you are.
without further ado,
Yes, please, without further ado.
please enjoy our conversation with David Yokum. Welcome, David Yokum, to the Behavioral Groups podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you. And you are not in DC at your normal office today. Where are you?
It is true. I just moved a couple of weeks ago to Providence, Rhode Island. And so I'm hitting you from New England.
Wow.
From, as you flagged a minute ago, a very weird backdrop that you can't see since you're listening to this, but I have a lot of concrete around me because I'm in a brutalist building.
It's not actually a prison, but it looks like a prison.
It's got the feel of the inside of a submarine. There's like pipes and things that are exposed, but it's comfortable and I like it. And my view is very nice.
Good. Okay, well, we're going to get started with a quick speed round. So, you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. Up the mountain or down the mountain?
Up the mountain.
Bicycle or unicycle?
Bicycle. The mere fact that I'm laughing suggests that the imagery of a unicycle is itself ridiculous.
Michelangelo or Monet?
Michelangelo. Hey, they made a David, so
Yeah, that was pretty good. Good one.
Yeah.
A full night's sleep or study all night before the big exam or event?
Full night's sleep, and the research on that is in. That's the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. A favorite Irish whiskey?
I don't know if it's Irish or not. I assume so, but anything with a lot of, I like the peaty whiskeys.
Yeah.
In particular, the smoky feel, and also the idea that, the way peat is made is through old dirt and moss that over literally thousands of years collects on the ground, and then they, as a part of the distillation process, they burn it, and it's the smoke from this that gives it the smoky flavor. And so the prospect that you have a drink that has literally thousands of years of dirt accumulation that's behind the taste is kind of a interesting reflective thought while you take a sip.
I would be at the opposite end of the liking part of the thinking about 1,000 years of dirt being in my drink. But to each their own. There you go.
That's right.
That's wonderful. And just listeners, there was a inside story there because David and Tim had Irish whiskey drinks one night a long time ago.
Well, there might have been some.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, it's true. It's true indeed. Yeah. I don't remember what we had though.
I know, that's the problem.
You were like a good guide on this issue and I think you tipped me at that time towards like a return to enjoying whiskeys again that has stuck with me ever since then.
Wow. I'm not happy about taking credit for that on one level, but I guess we'll just have to celebrate that. That next time we get together, we'll actually make that happen. Okay. Last question. Last speed round question. Transparency in government decision making or no transparency in government decision making?
Transparency.
Yeah.
That's a softball question for
Well,
me, and maybe we get into some of the stuff I've been doing on that front.
Exactly.
It would be very ironic if I had not said transparency at this moment, as will maybe become clear later.
Would have scared the hell out of me if you would have said non-transparency. So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing at the lab.
Yeah, well, so I have been working, as you guys know, but for listeners, inside of government for the last 6 or 7 years or so. I come at this as a cognitive psychologist and lawyer by training. So I was doing research on judgment and decision making, but came into the government trenches first in the Obama administration to do work around thinking about the ways in which behavioral insights and methods can influence policies and programs, and also trying to put a lot of extra thought into elevating government's capacity to do that type of work and to do real-time field experiments as part of the iterative design and learning stages. And so that came to be known as the White House's Social and Behavioral Sciences team.
Yep.
an entity that is actually still there. It's just, what you need to Google is the Office of Evaluation Sciences at the General Service Administration. And then I pivoted from that, actually before the election happened, to the mayor's office in the District of Columbia to set up a scientific team there that's called the Lab at DC now. That's similarly doing a lot of legwork around increasing government's capacity to bring empirical insights to methods as kind of a core day-to-day part of its process of developing policies and delivering programs. And the interventions there are, the full spectrum of both kind of lighter touch behavioral insights, but also bigger things. And maybe we'll give some examples of that as we talk.
Yeah.
And then my latest gig, just to drop the seed while we're laying everything out on the table, is that I just moved to Brown University to set up a new lab or center. It doesn't even have a name quite yet, but we'll continue this type of work here in Rhode Island, but also setting up a place for work across the entire country with states and localities everywhere.
So let's talk about that for a little bit, because I'm curious. It sounds like this is going to be something that would be available to all states and all cities then to adopt a model that you'll be creating at Brown.
So I don't think the idea is so much that we'll have so much capacity here that we could literally be the scientific team for the world. I mean, that's a fun thought, but I actually think that the way this type of work needs to be implemented at a scale is by elevating the capacity of government itself, the frontline agencies, the staffs that are there. So what I really have more in mind is, putting another kind of example model on the map that can inspire other jurisdictions. I think we just need more illustrations of how this type of work can be done. I think it does also open up some opportunities for coordinating a multitude of different cities, counties, or states to collaborate on multi-site experiments, just because there's a lot of questions that I think the methods that are needed to answer them are going to need, more things that any one city could do on its own, or any one state could do on its own. And so this is going to be a new kind of platform for this movement, if you will, that'll open up some additional kind of resources and opportunities to think about how to do that.
So
I love it.
I know it's fascinating stuff. So David, if you go back into thinking about your work at the White House, and as you were doing that, what were some of the hurdles that you had to overcome? And then what were some of the bigger successes in your mind? I mean, I know there's a ton of work, and if again, to that point, if you just go out and Google that, you get an annual report from the social and behavioral sciences team and everything that you did. But what were some of the hurdles first off, and then what would you say were some of the bigger kind of successes that you might have seen?
I mean, for one thing, science is hard. So a first hurdle is just the very process of figuring out the right answer to something. And particularly when you're in the behavioral space, understanding why people are behaving the way that they are, thinking about how context influences what we do. We know a lot of kind of fundamental principles about how memory works, how attention works, how motivational systems work, that kind of are guiding principles on how to think about these things. But how it manifests in any one specific place gets really difficult. And so, we had some early trials where, for example, what I thought was going to be a low-hanging fruit project of replicating an experiment that was done in the UK, where they sent out mailers to people showing them that most people in their area pay their taxes on time.
Oh, this is the Michael Hall.
But you haven't?
Yeah.
So we tried to do something similar there. I was initially thinking this is going to be an easy three-pointer, show the success right away, take a couple of weeks. And well, for one thing, it certainly didn't take a couple of weeks. I'll come back to a second on just how hard it is to implement anything. But even once we implemented it, it didn't work. And, when you look back at the portfolio of projects that we've done, and one of the things I'm very proud of is that you can actually look back, and we talk about our no results also, most stuff doesn't really work, at least not the first time you do it, which is why it's important to kind of iterate on it. But that is a first barrier, is that science is hard. And it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of dedication, trying lots and lots and lots of things before you finally land on something working. Second thing, I just hinted at it, is that it is difficult to do anything in a large organization. And government is, of course, a very large organization, and one that is actually probably more difficult to work in from an implementation standpoint than many private firms, just because there are so many different stakeholders who have a legitimate claim to power, whether it's the executive side versus the legislative side versus other stakeholder groups. And so coordinating everyone's buy-in is not as simple as, a singular CEO saying this is what the business is going to do. You often need to build whole coalitions of people behind doing something. You often have a lot of bureaucracy in terms of contracts and things that were set up a year ago that can't be renegotiated until a year from now. Like, all of those different things can make it difficult to actually change something in the process to then test.
Right.
And so anyway, those are the two biggest categories, and there's a lot of examples of both of those I'm happy to go into.
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm assuming, and I'd like to hear more about the study that you're talking about paying taxes on time, but wasn't that really just looking at how you conveyed information? And so it's changing the letter or memo or communication that went out. And so you would think from a stakeholder buy-in perspective, it should be a relatively easy slam dunk. But obviously it sounds like that isn't the case. Can you help expand on that a little bit? Why do you think, if indeed my assumptions are right, it being a relatively simple A/B testing or ABC testing, help us understand how that went.
Yeah, so it's simple on paper, no pun intended, but like literally on paper. If you look at the before and after letters, it's something that, did it on a Word document.
Yeah.
But behind any government form you see are often lots of different systems that are implicated. And so I'm going to blur the examples just a little bit here and say a few things that aren't only that tax one. But, for instance, if you wanted to do something like redesign the way you're asking for a person's contact information and changing the fields by which they, whether it's typing it in or writing in the answer, easy to do on the page, but there are often very large systems, IT systems behind it that are taking those input fields that have also been programmed to link up with, maybe a dozen or 24 other fields. And for anybody that's done programming, changing a single digit on how all of that stuff works means you got to change it systematically through all of the systems.
Yeah,
and in government, those systems might be owned by different agencies. And so maybe you're suddenly talking about, 12 different IT people that need to all be coordinated to make sure that the change on the paper form cascades properly through all the IT systems. And it's not that any one person objects to it. So to your point about who's against making a form a little bit better, the answer is often like nobody is. Everybody's for it. But the somebody there is actually somebody's. It's 12 people. It's 12 conversations. and it adds up pretty quick when you think about the number of hours of the day you've got to go through to land that eventually.
Yeah. So it's a bigger issue than changing this communication to have a different header and various different pieces. There's all the back end stuff that goes. And again, in business, it can happen too, where again, those forms and IT and variety of different stakeholders that you have. So that makes sense.
Yeah. So
and let me just give you one other example, because I think unless you've been in this, it can lose you. So there's another line of project we were doing related to the Affordable Care Act, in particular, the kind of information presentation about healthcare options and things like that. And let's say you want to do something like just think a little bit more carefully about the order in which you're presenting the healthcare options. And this is drawing on research suggesting that order matters. People start to pay less and less attention as they go further and further down the list. And so it can make an influence on the ultimate healthcare choice a person makes as a function of whether you sort by, say, premium or ultimate out-of-pocket cost or deductible, whatever the case may be. And so maybe you want to do some testing where you vary which of those attributes you're sorting on. Well, one of the things that came into play in thinking about doing this was that in call centers across the country, where hundreds of people have been trained on how to answer the phone when people are calling to get verbal help on how to navigate the website, they have these manuals that allow them to talk through what the people are seeing on the screen. Well, the simple change of A/B testing on the website, which you could do pretty simply in a coding standpoint, suddenly gets exponentially harder if you're now talking about having to change physically hundreds or even thousands of manuals that are being shipped across the country and put in the hands of call center staff who then need to be trained about which of the different manuals they're using, because they will literally say on the phone, look at your screen, your options are going to be sorted by premium or deductible. So it's that kind of thing.
That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. Yeah. Well, let's get back to the. I just want to follow up on the tax study, because we're on the tax letter issue, because we're actually going to be talking to Michael Halsworth here in just a couple of weeks. So this is particularly relevant, and he's really good about talking about things that he tried and failed with, especially when there was good science to indicate this is likely going to win. This might not be a slam dunk, but it's going to be pretty damn close. So what happened? So what happened with the letter going out to remind people to pay their taxes?
Yeah, so it's great you have Michael on. He's awesome, a dear friend. Give him some crap from me though that his study didn't work when I tried to do it the first time. I try to give him grief on this every time I talk to him. So please join me in that effort.
We can do that. We are esprit de corps.
So the idea animated in a lot of these letter experiments are, of course, inclusive of some just basic simplifications. On the letter we did, it was doing things like taking the hyperlink that a person, it's not a hyperlink, it's a physical mailer, but the URL they had to type into the screen to go to the website on the paper version was like 60 characters long with ampersands and all kinds of crazy stuff in it. So just think about the human error that happens in trying to transfer it over. So we did stuff like fix that to just make it, pay my taxes. The deeper psychological stuff here, though, and the one that usually gets the most amount of airtime in thinking about these experiments, has to do with social norm comparisons. Mm-hmm. So by telling someone about their delinquency on a payment, or in other domains, telling them about how much more electricity, say, they're using than their peers, it sets up this contrast that can tap into a couple of different things. One way of unpacking this is that it is an information conveyance. You didn't know that you were actually doing something unusual. You thought everybody else was acting differently that wasn't also paying or was using a lot of extra, electricity. And so realizing you're outside of the norm can kind of prompt you to go on an information search of like, oh, I didn't mean to be doing this. What should I do differently? A different track is one of more social pressure, just a general tendency for people not to like to be deviant, frankly. And so realizing that you are an outsider can trigger some kind of basic pulls towards a desire to fit back in with whatever the norm behavior is. Again, whether that's paying taxes or using less electricity or not littering as much, kind of whatever you name it is. So there's a couple of different psychological mechanisms that are at play here, but they all feed into an ultimate intervention, which is something like a sentence saying, like I think this is what Mike did in the UK, 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time, right? Which signals like you're one of the 1 of 10. You're rare, you're doing something deviant. We try to do a similar thing in the US, and it's important to bear in mind these are true facts you're conveying. You want to give like the true payment rate. You don't want to make stuff up. Right. And in our case, I think there's some differences in how we did this than what Mike did. And I think probably one of the biggest differences to my mind has to do with who we were sending the letters to and when. Okay. We happen to have a population that was just much more delinquent, having not paid taxes for just a much longer period of time. And I think this starts to matter because, being a day late has a segment of people that if you kind of remind them, they might still have the money to pay it right then and there. And getting that letter, what you're really doing is just making them pay sooner rather than later, which is good and it matters because government loses interest and all kinds of stuff like that. But if you're many, many, many months behind, a higher and higher likelihood you've gotten to that point of trouble because you don't actually have the finances to pay. And if you're in that state, a reminder letter to pay isn't going to solve your problem. You don't have the cash in pocket. And so that's a situation where a different conversation needs to be had in contrast to just reminding someone who has the money, like, hey, you might not have realized it, but you're a little bit behind. And that's abnormal.
Yeah. Well, I know Michael talked a little bit about the formality effect as one of the issues in some of his studies that he said didn't work, where the letters that had come had been very formal and on the letterhead with all of the element. And there's an element of that lends credibility versus the more visual appealing graphic kind of look, where it then gets dismissed as maybe not being as important. And so that was an interesting component. Again, all of the other research that he had done and all the other experiments before that were showing these interventions actually work. And then at some point he either crossed the line, or the audience or the context was such that now it doesn't. And those are the interesting parts of like understanding, to your point, maybe our audience was different. Maybe the context of when they're paying is different. Maybe their circumstance.
Delinquency. Yeah, it's huge.
All of those, because we tend to go, well, it worked here, it should work, here. And
yeah.
the case.
Yeah. I mean, I've had another study that we did in a totally different setting, where took a very stuffy, formal, ugly letter, made it very beautiful and jazzy, and the beautiful jazzy one lost out.
Yeah.
And part of the way I thought of it then is that it was almost so well designed, it didn't look like a government letter. And everything got lost as if it was spam coming from a bank solicitation or something like that.
Exactly.
So there's something to be said for formality when it comes to government communication.
Yeah, I mean, like in some settings, at least now, there could be places where people are expecting a little bit of bureaucracy, and it kind of can slip through the cracks if they don't see it. Maybe we can change that. I hope we change this norm over time, but that's a thing, and it does illustrate exactly this point that there's basic concepts there at play about what's grabbing a person's attention, what's priming them to think about whether this is a voluntary or a kind of obligatory situation, but exactly how that pans out really turns on a lot of the particularities of context, timing, who the person is, and often there's no way to know the best design at that level of specificity unless you couple the basic principles with real-time A/B testing.
Right.
Yeah. I'd like to. So let's move forward to the lab at DC. The time, one of your earliest and sort of biggest in my simple worldview. The coolest things that you did was you launched the first really major A/B study on police officer body cams. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding because body cams get a lot of press, right? I mean, there's always this push for transparency. And I remember I think the first time we were talking about this, you hadn't released the data, but you said, it's just not as simple as it looks. And so I was wondering if you could talk a minute and share with our listeners about that study and about some of the revelations and findings that came from that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a space where starting, I guess, about 5 or so years ago, and amidst a lot of public sort of discussion and rightful anxiety around police community relations, a lot of this was sparked further by shootings, particularly young Black men that happened under questionable circumstances, led to a lot of kind of throwing things at this problem, one of which was this thought that cameras as a technology could be a particularly powerful solution. And this is drawing into some of the psychology on how people tend to behave differently if they're perceived to be watched. The research here, actually, if you look at it, is not a complete slam dunk. It doesn't always work, but there are classic studies. Hawthorne effects is something that's kind of infiltrated the common imagination just a little bit. But, it's this thought that if somebody's working on the assembly line and the boss comes and is looking at them, they'll start to work a little bit faster. There's been studies since then showing that, if you've got the office coffee pot where you go up and you make your coffee and there's like a little donation can next to it, if you do something as simple as like put a poster on the wall that has somebody looking at it, people are more likely to happily drop the dollar in to volunteer. It's like, subtle stuff like this, where if you feel like you're being watched, everybody tends to put on their best behavior.
Right.
And so the thought was that this might happen if you put cameras on officers. And not only for officers, I mean, depending on who you are, you might have your attention go to either the officer or civilians. But in either case, both people modulate or change their behavior such that the hope is at the end of the day, the likelihood that there's any need to use violence or violence use goes down, which everybody agrees would be a good thing. As the cameras were spreading, there's they're expensive, they're difficult to implement. There's a lot of privacy implications about having more mass surveillance around, and good psychological theory to think that it might work, but not really a lot of knowledge of whether it does, frankly.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned, there are some studies where this stuff doesn't replicate. There's also, a reason why you sometimes get these YouTube videos of really horrible things happening, even though you've got a crowd of 10 people around with their iPhone out. Those are camera situations. Why is that happening anyway? And so it's a little bit of an open question, right, on whether those effects are going to really happen. And so, to the tremendous credit of the chief of police in DC, then Kathy Lanier, now Peter Newsham, also the mayor there was this kind of joint commitment to thinking it was an idea that was worth giving it a good shake, but also one that it was important to test and see whether it worked. And so what we did.
Yeah, exactly. So what was the premise, and how did you set up the study?
What we did is we took advantage of the new rollout of the cameras to roll them out by way of a randomized design. So just imagine flipping a coin. If it's a heads, an officer gets a camera. If it's a tails, they don't. And so you end up with these two groups of officers, the heads group with cameras and the tails group that doesn't. And you can compare these groups. And the randomization is key. I mean, relative to, for example, if you just went from east to west, it might be that the east happened to have more crime and uses of force than the west, and so you get confounded on that. If you asked officers to volunteer, maybe only the best office, quote, best officers come up and get the cameras. If you ask sergeants to hand them out, maybe they hand them out to officers they're the most worried about. In all those scenarios, any difference you see, it might be the cameras, but it also might be the geography, who's willing to volunteer, who sergeants are telling. The coin flipping is a great equalizer.
Right.
It's going to end up with the right number, on average, the same balance of geography, of volunteer, of you name it. And so any difference you would see in things like uses of force, complaints, and so on, if you see a difference, an average difference, you can causally infer, as best as a scientist can, it was caused by the one thing you've controlled to be different,
right,
namely the camera, right? And this is the same thing we demand of drug companies testing whether a new chemotherapy cures patients. And so the thought here is like, let's use those same standards we use for medicine that we're putting in our body for social policies that we're putting out into our communities. And so we rolled them out that way, and we did it with the entirety of the police force that has interactions with residents. So it's the largest study in the world on this, which is important because when you get that much data in, it increases your ability to detect smaller and smaller average differences, right?
Yep.
And so we did that. We left it out in the field for a little bit over a year, although it kind of went in a rolling fashion. And so our span of data that we actually do in the analysis for any given officer group is about 7 months. And we compared a lot of different outcomes that we could measure on administrative data, by which I mean data that was already being collected for other purposes. So uses of force, for example, if an officer pulls out a weapon or a taser or anything like that, there's a record that is generated anyway, not so much for research purposes originally, but because those items, those sort of moments get tracked for purposes of investigation. Same for complaints, same for if a prosecution was given, how cases were being adjudicated. There's a lot of data there that we tapped into, tied it back to whether those officers had cameras or not, and then could compare those groups on those outcomes. And the punchline of this that Tim already alluded to a little bit is that we didn't, the average differences we detected between the groups on something like use of force complaints and actually everything that we looked at was so small, we couldn't tell it apart from just the random noise you would expect. So statistically insignificant or null results. No difference that we would actually think is real.
So the impact on behavior by having a body cam on actually didn't impact that behavior in a manner that you could see from the studies that you're doing. In other words, the change that might have been anticipated based on some of the research actually wasn't there, which I think is really important because now you have that data and that can then influence, you're not making assumptions about what these body cams are going to be.
That's right. And, there's additional things to think about here. And actually, if you go and read the paper are, which you can find if you just go to bwc.thelab.dc.gov for body-worn camera.thelab.dc.gov. Most of the paper and a lot of the discussion that I've really wanted to make sure we've had publicly about this study is all of the things that a null result can mean and not mean, right? And so one obvious interpretation, and in many ways one of the most important ones, is that the cameras might not really cause a big, large average difference on things like use of force and complaints.
Yeah.
But that's not the only thing, right? So it could be the case, for instance, that cameras have an effect either on behavior on the street or maybe usefulness in resolving complaints down the road in a very, very small number of cases, but maybe those cases are really important.
Mm-hmm.
The reason this is important is that we're measuring average differences here, which, even though we're the largest study and well-powered in so many different ways, the possibility that maybe the cameras made a big difference in, 1 or 5 different cases is not something that we can rule out, right? So this is just a limitation of basically any study. We've made a further progress on it, but we didn't measure every single instance, and that could conceivably happen.
Yeah.
Another thing is that the effects of the cameras are maybe manifesting in ways that aren't captured in the administrative data we have. So, for example, one thing that we don't measure here, but is one of the big hopes for camera programs, is that perhaps they just influence the perceived legitimacy of the police force. Maybe the fact that there are cameras out there just makes everyone feel better about the policing environment. We don't have any, because we didn't have the resources to do it at any time, any survey data asking people how legitimate they think the police is over time as the cameras are being rolled out. So that's still a very live possibility. A third one would be that maybe there were instances of bad behavior that were happening that were never captured in the administrative data in the first place, that have now been quashed, but because they were never in the administrative data in the first place, we're not going to see any change because we never saw it in the first place. What would be the baseline to change from? And then the final thing I'll say here is that the context of the District of Columbia is, of course, different than the context of lots of different cities. We have a unique history of police reform over the last 20 years. There's a lot of specialized training that happens with this police force, as you might imagine, handling the quantity of protests and presidential police and everything that exists there. All of those things together, there could be certain sorts of behaviors in police forces that don't exist in the district because of that history. So maybe there were bad behaviors that would have been squashed, but they're not here again. I usually pause at this moment when I'm talking to other chiefs of police to say that all of those other interpretations of the null aside doesn't mean you get to just ignore the average effect that we do detect here. I like to think that this is going to pivot the focus to where, if what you were expecting was that rolling the camera program out was going to give you these large average shifts, this study should give you pause and sort of lower your probability assessment of that happening. Or in addition, make you think about, let's say you start to play on that dimension of, well, my police force is really different than the district, my last kind of category of the null result.
Yeah.
Well, if you go there, and I think you should, let's also have a discussion about the things the District of Columbia Police Department has done over the last 20 years to train its officers, which prompts up a choice. Do you want to do the technology, or do you want to do some of these training activities? And there's pros and cons those ways, but that's prompting a different line of thinking about it. So all of those things together is where even a null result can push the thinking in a way that I've been very pleased to seem to be happening both in the region, but nationally, and frankly, even across the world.
Well, and then it also lends itself to future research. So when other cities are rolling this out, and if they are putting in any type of research around this, it informs some of the questions that they now can be asking, to exactly your point on some of those other confluences that could have impacted this. You can now start hopefully studying some of that and getting better data and better research. So
that's totally right. And I think a whole frontier here, and this was actually one that the police department in DC was interested in, is the possibility of the video footage itself being useful for feedback in its training programs to officers. So, the prime thing that was getting most discussion at the onset of this in the country was around change in behavior on the street. But really, that's only one category of thing that could be useful about a camera program. The video footage itself can be useful for training. We might be able to use it as a piece of data, so to speak, to run research on interactions that are happening in the street to see if we can identify cues of when violence is more or less likely to occur and then train officers on that. And I guess I would also say that in our study, we did look in how complaints were being resolved and cases being prosecuted, but it's still very early days here. For one thing, our data wasn't as good at this frontier just because the administrative data in the court system has a little bit more quirks that we weren't able to sort through. But how attorneys, investigators were using the footage as part of their investigation is not something we have observational and qualitative data on. So, there's a world in which perhaps the video footage can be extremely useful in those proceedings in a way that we didn't detect. But the reason we didn't detect it here is that the people that are in that system haven't learned how to use the video footage quite right. So maybe as they change the norms and start to use the evidence at different times in different ways, maybe it really will start to help the resolution of complaints. But there again, this can prompt thinking and discussion in that direction.
Yeah, so adjudication, the study didn't include a clear recommendation on the viability or the value of the video footage to the prosecutorial side of this whole thing. Is that right?
Yeah, we didn't detect it, which again, the interpretation I give on this is it's still a very live possibility. That's where the value is going to be found.
Yeah.
But the lesson is you can't just throw the camera program out there and wash your hands and think it's done. Like, we need to focus on how the video footage, like, is it getting to the prosecutors, investigators at the right time? What are the rules of evidence? It's like, there's a lot of other details here that have to be paid attention to in terms of the implementation. And the fact that we got the null, I think, has kind of been a little bit of a kick on people to be like, yeah, actually, we do need to think more deeply about that and have a little bit more attention on that, and not just assume it's going to fall in its place on its own.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all of those lessons, I think, are really important and interesting as we're moving forward. So that's one of the, as Tim mentioned, kind of the bigger studies that you did. Is there any recent work that you've done that is just really fun, or that you find really that this is the one I talk about at cocktail parties when I'm out?
Because there's so much government research that is so fun to talk about.
It would be a cocktail party with Tim and me. That would be really interesting. For the rest of the, your friends and family are sick of it. But any really fun things that you're finding? Any fun research that you've been doing?
So I find all of this stuff fun, as y'all should know.
Well said, David.
We should have a cocktail party. There we go.
Yeah, I like different things about different projects. I'll give you more examples, but to pivot off of that concept, I will tell you one of the things I like about the body-worn camera project is that it illustrates how the core elements of thinking about behavioral design and testing, which so often we give the examples of like changing a letter or something like that. It's a proof point that those same approaches can be done for much more complicated, expensive social programs like a physical technology being rolled out to thousands of officers, right? So the opportunity for this approach is just massive and in all kinds of different places, not only low cost behavioral nudging type things.
That's a great takeaway, actually. That in and of itself is a big deal.
Yeah, applying that science thinking.
Science works.
Yeah.
Right. But there's another project that sort of hilariously gets a lot of attention that we did in the district, and this is with Peter Casey and Kevin Wilson on my team. I should have also plugged along with Chief Newsham and Lanier, Anita Ravishankar, Alex Kopik, other great people that were working on the Bodycam study. But the one I'm pivoting to now is around the problem of rats, which in the district and for many other municipalities is a big one. Nobody really likes rats, although I think rats sometimes, they're not as mean as people think. Actually, mice are a lot meaner than rats, I can tell you from earlier days of my life. But the problem here was, where are they? Because there is a small team of people in the district that actually go out into the streets and do mitigation efforts.
Okay.
And they have a limited number of hours in the day, and they can't hit everywhere. And so there's a triage problem here. And this, like so many other triage sort of situations, is one where if we could have better predictive models of where the problem is likely to be, where the rats are likely to be, then we can send out those scarce resources more efficiently. And so the project was taking, again, administrative data, so things like, you know, information about the layout of the city, of where 311 complaints are coming in, of where water is located, et cetera, bring them all together and trying to build a model that ranks the likelihood that a rat would be found if you went to any geographic patch of land. So we did that. I think the part of this project that I like the most, there's two things. One is, and this is something I emphasize on all the work that we do, you can't just like take a data set and start running models on it, even though this happens all the time. And I think it's a big mistake that a lot of data scientists make. You need to go through a stage of learning about the program that's behind the data. So in this instance, you need to actually go out and learn how you track down and kill rats. You need to talk to the rodent vector team. You need to know about rat biology. And it can feed back into relevant decisions about how you use the data. You know, so something like, what's the right geographic unit to set for your model development? Could it be informed about what do we know about how rats nest and how likely they are to move around, because it sets a bound on how likely it is, you know? So it can feed into the model, but the only way you get there is to learn a lot about the program and the context. The second thing is that you can't just stop with developing the model. The way this often happens is that you take part of the data set, you fit a model to it, and then you test how well it works to predict that second part of the data set that you held out. But of course, that's all still the data set you had at initially, which is different than what's going to happen whenever you deploy the model out, not only into the future, but you're putting the model in the hands of staff who are then going to use it, all of which is relevant for the ultimate thing you really care about, which is, does it work in the field for real? And so this is one where we tried to go out and not only develop the model and, you know, so-called cross-validate it in the data set we had, but we deployed it for a period of time and measured whether the predictions we were making, you know, if there was a place we said there's a 9 out of 10 chance you're going to find a rat there. Well, when we went there 10 times for real, did we find a rat 9 times?
9 out of 10.
As a way of empirically testing and measuring whether the model worked. And unfortunately, it didn't work so great, which I think is actually great for the point I'm making, though, which is that it cross-validated well, but didn't work so well in the field. And so it's prompted additional thinking about how to make further fine-tuning on the model, which is what I think is the right sort of approach again, because it taps into this sort of recognition that you're often, as a part of doing science, which is really hard, going to have to continue to iterate, measure it. It's not going to work perfectly. Iterate again, measure it again. And like, you got to keep doing that until you hit some level of acceptable accuracy, and then you move on to the next task.
So how the hell do you know that mice are meaner than rats?
So when I was in high school and college, I was working in a pharmacology lab in high school, and then I was a biology major in undergrad. So I was doing neuroscience, and as part of that, a lot of the research is done through rat and mice models. And so I just had to handle a lot of the little buggers. And mice, the little cute looking ones, they're actually like really mean. They're much more likely to bite you, to get angry. Rats, on the other hand, they look nasty. They've got the little red eyes and the creepy looking tail, but they're pretty friendly. I mean, if you use one or the other for a pet, you'd want to do a rat. I mean, they also, unfortunately, you know, carry disease and eat through your wires and stuff. And so we don't really want them in our backyard. But, you know, they in their heart of hearts, I think they get a nicer than you might think.
Yeah. Well, my daughter wants a rat for a pet. So, you know, my 8-year-old daughter is looking, and she said, can we get a rat? And I'm like, oh, yeah, we'll think about it. All right?
That's going to be hard. If I were the dad in that would be a hard.
I just said we have a cat. The cat and the rat might not get along. So we need to think about that. So,
yeah.
All right.
Can we talk a little bit about music, David? You are a big music listener. I know that. You like a lot of different kinds of music. Tell the listeners about who you're listening to these days. That who's on your playlist. What artists are you listening to? What types of music are you listening to these days?
Oh, it's a good question. It's funny. It's harder. It's almost harder to answer this question. I'm realizing now, in a day when you have Spotify and all the other apps that curate your music.
Yeah.
I'm actually, as we're talking, I'm pulling up my phone just to look back at Spotify because I'm somewhat less actively curating and more just up, down voting. And I think a consequence as you scan through my list, I don't really listen to a full album or anything anymore.
Right. It's not
songs coming through.
Right. It's not the same as when we used to go to actually take out a vinyl disc and put it on a record player or even a CD.
Yeah.
And we take it off the shelf, open it up, put it in a CD player, and say, "This is one of the 5 I'm going to be listening to right now." And all that intention and action was a better way of connecting to the artist. And I think
it's also interesting too. Like we talk about mixtapes and how the younger generation have no idea what a mixtape is.
So sad.
And the amount of work that went into making a mixtape for somebody else. It was anyway, Dave, go ahead.
Well, I don't know about the vinyl record example. If I can make it but I did have my share of mixtapes before the CDs came in. I mean, I don't know. I bet people curate playlists now and share them through Spotify and things like that. I've got to think that's the modern day.
It happens.
Cassette play, right?
Yeah, but I don't think, again, to the level of effort that went into a mixtape, particularly if you were trying to do it from an album onto your mixtape and getting...
It was real time.
It was real, and you had to, and then you have that second interlude in between, and sometimes it was longer. Anyway, we're just...
No, I mean, the symbolic sweat you had to put into it, and you did have a physical... You had a physical thing you could give to the person, and so the kind of moment of giving a present was more tangible, which I think is probably not a trivial thing. In the same way that even today, being able to, send a thank you by way of a letter just feels very different than the same content delivered by email. And I think there's something about probably a mixture of the recognition that a little extra effort had to go into it. It also has the tangible thing in your hand effect. And it probably captures just more of your attention because it's in your hand. You're not looking at 10 other things at the screen at the same time. Yeah. I don't know. You do lose a little bit of something through the digital medium, I guess.
Yeah, kind of getting back to Michael Hallsworth's East model, right? It's attractive, it's social. I don't know how timely it would be, but there is those two factors are really, they absolutely come through. So what does your Spotify curation list look like these days?
So I'm literally pulling up the list to just look at the last few songs that I added on. Hopefully this won't be horribly embarrassing or anything.
We'll make it so.
So here are I'll just read it out. We'll see what happens. So Whale by Yellow Ostrich, Fool You've Landed by Mumford and Sons.
Okay.
Palace by Matthew and the Atlas. And then I'm kind of all over the place. I've got Society by Eddie Vedder. That's actually one that is the exception to what we were just talking about, where Eddie Vedder of what was the band he was in the 80s? Pearl Jam. Yeah. His album Into the Wild is one that was behind the movie Into the Wild. That actually, I think the experience that you can have through the movie on that is one of going through the whole album. And I have found myself that is the one thing on my Spotify list that when that song comes on, I'll often switch to the album directly and listen through it. And I don't know if it's because it partly taps to the memories of watching the movie, which I don't know if you've seen this movie, but it's a beautiful one where it follows a guy that kind of goes off the grid. And I think he dropped out of school or work or something like that, gets into a van and goes out west into the wilderness. And the movie just kind of follows him. And so there's this good music from Vedder coupled with really majestic scenery of nature. Maybe
Yeah.
there's some like coupling of the two and remembering that story of kind of what it's like to go off the grid and live on your own. That maybe comes back to me a little bit with those songs.
Well, it
It's-
makes it vivid,
yeah.
right? I mean, it really adds vividness when you add all this visual component and a storyline that's compelling.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of my favorite books. So, which is a fascinating book, and I think gets into it. I have not seen the movie, so now I'm interested in seeing the movie, hearing Eddie Vedder's soundtrack, and comparing that to my experience. Actually, the book inspired me 20 some years ago when it came out to actually go and do a 30-day drive around the country in my $600 Toyota Tercel wagon, and just with a tent and a backpack, and basically go off the grid as much as I could. So
I'll tell you, so I coincidentally had one of my best musical experiences this month. I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and it was part of a event where the premier's office there, so like their president office there, had brought in Matthew Mole to play at essentially like a dinner function. And just by chance, Matthew Mole is his name, Mole, I think. I don't think he's really penetrated the American market quite yet, but he's very big in South Africa and through a lot of that continent, and I think Europe and things like that. It wouldn't surprise me if this is the sort of name that, you know, he wins a Grammy or something in 2 years from now. So I feel lucky that I kind of caught him as he's going big, but not so big. It's inconceivable he would do what I'm describing, which is play at a pretty small venue where I was lucky enough to just by chance sit at the table that turned out to be literally adjacent to the stage. Like I could touch the stage. It also meant the speaker was like right behind me. And so when it started playing, it, like blew my clothes off. But it was just amazing. And to see someone, you know, that talented, that up close and personal is just always impressive to see, whether it's music or dance or anything, sport. You know, it's this comparison of just someone who has so much raw talent that they've curated through so much raw practice that it's just kind of beautiful to see and experience up and I hadn't actually been to a live concert in a while, and so it was also fun for that reason. And so Matthew Mole.
That's cool. That's awesome. I love it, because one of the things I'm always interested in checking out new music constantly, you know, I mean, because there's so much, there's absolutely so much. So, so that's terrific. What 3 tips would you leave our listeners with today? What could you share with our listeners for people who are interested in trying to do some kind of experimentation or piloting or testing in their office or possibly government environment? I know that we have listeners who actually work in the federal government. What would you suggest, David, for them to get started or to be successful in making some tests?
Well, so one thing would just be to say, get started on something, almost anything. I think there can be a misconception sometimes that the way these efforts get off the ground has to begin with a executive order or a mayoral command or something very official on top with lots of budget. I think this misperception often arises because the stories become bigger in the media once you've like hit that point. Like a lot of people came to know of the social and behavioral sciences team once President Obama issued the executive order behind the team and encouraging teams to use it. But we've been around for 2 years by then.
yeah.
And so you often just have to get started. And a lot of my first projects there were, like the first project I did was on something called the industrial funding fee. And it was a A/B test on a website. Stumbled across it while basically talking to a dude in a basement who mentioned something about the website. It had to do with collecting a fee and the way that businesses self-reported the fee, and then like millions of dollars at stake. And I was like, they self-report it? Do you check it? And they're like, well, we don't really have any staff to check it. And it reminded me of an experiment where if you have people sign their name or say they're going to be accurate before a process rather than the end, they're more precise. So we threw it up on the website, A/B tested it, saved a few $1 million. You know, very opportunistic, and just did it, right? And so when you're in your office environment thinking about what we can do, like just start, do something. And the things that you test initially don't necessarily have to be the most theoretically sophisticated, groundbreaking types of things. So think about the example I gave about the URL link on that tax letter, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to be a PhD trained psychologist to know that it's a bad idea to have 70 characters and ampersands and things like that in a URL. And if you find yourself in places where you have people on your team kind of having intuitive fights over the best way to do a design, well, don't duke it out over your intuitions. Try them all out simultaneously. Flip that coin, throw it out there. And I think it's important just because if you start doing that, you can kind of build up your mojo a bit on how to do the designs. You know, if you couple it with just trying to kind of read about this type of work, it will inspire different ideas. And you can start to meet other people who are doing it that you can talk to and share ideas on, and it can kind of grow from that. Would be one suggestion. A second suggestion would be, particularly if you're in the behavioral insight type of space, I do think there's a point where investing some time and really understanding the underlying psychology is worth it. How does memory actually work? What do we know about visual attention, or how you grab someone's auditory attention, or any number of different spaces? And I come at this from the direction of seeing lots of places where, and I don't mean for this to conflict with the advice I was giving on the first prong, because I think you do need to just like kind of start, but like at some point you don't want to just be taking, you know, the social norm nudge and kind of wielding it everywhere willy-nilly, because context does matter. And so if you go back to the roots, the psychological roots a little bit, to understand the mechanisms behind what led to those nudges working in some cases, you elevate your sophistication to design things better in advance, right? To design things better in advance.
So agree with that.
Yeah.
The third thing I would say is invest a lot of time observing and talking and just trying to get your feel for what the problem is. Here again is a space that you often see people jump straight to testing a particular thing, throwing it out in an RCT, you know, get a null average result, but they really skip too fast over more observational, qualitative discussions with people that can inform what the problem is. So think back to that example on, you know, really getting to learn how rats work. You know, if you're doing a form simplification, have you talked to lots of people who fill out that form? You know, if you're redesigning the benefits application for Medicaid, you really got to put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who is finding themselves at those kind of tough financial straits where they need to rely on this program. And if you haven't personally experienced that, you need to talk to a lot of people who have. You need to go visit the clinics or the sites where those forms get submitted. And I think that's important just because it's amazing where the kind of inspiration or realization of where the constraints actually occur can come in to play. And it's often different than what people's first draft opinions are. You know, I remember there was a project we did at DC that was with the one of the agencies that handles kind of permit applications and things like that. And there was a lot of long delay times in a particular part of this stage getting processed. And the first intuition of some of the folks around there was like, all right, well, let's get all the administrative together. We can do some complicated algorithmic work, and we can like identify the time points between the chains, and that'll be places where we can do process improvements around that. Which is like, all right, great. But let's also go apply for some permits ourselves and secret shopper this and like hang out and see it. And when you did that, we discovered this one point in time where a person had to take a form from a person at one desk and walk 20 feet across the building to another desk and hand the form to a different government employee because the back-end IT systems weren't connected. And of course, having to go in and take a form across the office means you got to physically get there.
Yeah.
This is a burden, right? So like that's a very basic example that when you actually go and put yourselves in the shoes, it like hits you on the face. This is a problem, but it's amazing how much people skip the qualitative work, the observational work, the talking to people work. And I think it's just this kind of, I don't know what it is. It's like jumping too fast to thinking that the data you have is going to be the source of all wisdom and knowledge for the problem. And admittedly, it is harder to take the time to go and observe and talk, but that's where so much of the real thinking on these ideas comes from. And if you look at people who've had breakthroughs in social sciences, they're often individuals who spend just an inordinate amount of time talking and observing people and self-reflecting on their own life. Yeah. And it's you can't underestimate that, I think.
I mean, if you look at Thaler, Kahneman, all of their stories are about reflecting on the experiences that they go, and then trying to figure out why that's happening, as opposed to getting a problem or an issue. It's more of the reflective component.
Well, I think about the work of so much of George Loewenstein's work, one of our mutual buddies. I mean, George is just so curious, and it's because he's so aware. I think so much of his work comes from the actual awareness of what's going on in the world around him, and he's curious about, well, why is that happening? And and he follows it.
And there's another dimension of this. I think you said 3 pieces of advice. I'll count this as a half. So I break the rules. But there's the dimension of just diversifying your observations and people that you're talking to. There's also the dimension of diversifying what you're reading, right? So particularly if you're a busy professional, and it's amazing, I find even academics do this, like you get so caught up and you're so overscheduled, you're so focused on publishing your next thing, you're following very closely your 10 other colleagues in your subspecialty field, that you're reading all their stuff, that if you're not careful, you kind of stop reading broadly.
How do you solve for that? How do you particularly solve for that?
You have to actively curate it. So for me, it begins with blocking out time in the morning. I literally block out time on my calendar for it says reading and thinking on my calendar, like literally. And, sometimes right at that period of time. And I get up, got my coffee going, sit down on the couch, comfy chair, maybe back in the bed if I'm particularly lazy, and like read for an hour. And sometimes do it at night too before bed. And try to read things that are diversified in the way that, I don't read. If you find yourself reading the same field 5 books in a row or something like that, you're not really in the spirit of what I'm describing here. And so it's, listening to recommendations. It is a place where I find going to physical bookstores help, so I don't get locked into just what online book retailers kind of put me in my own loop of, like, you read this book, so here's your next book that's like exactly the same but slightly different words. Physical bookstores, you just see other stuff. And I tend to be pretty generous with myself, to where if I see something that seems even remotely in the ballpark, I'll check it out or I'll buy it, under the thought that if I don't like it, I'll stop reading it. And so I'll stop reading it. I do the same thing on magazines and newspapers also. And this is a place where, for me, particularly working in government, but I think this is true for just, particularly in today's environment where everyone's getting so worked up about political polarization, it's useful to read a variety of different magazines and newspapers. And so I have, for magazine subscriptions, for example, I've got The Atlantic, I've got Jacobin, which is like a socialist magazine. I've got National Review, which is a much more conservative one. And there are all smart people at these different outlets who have very different perspectives on common policy problems. And if you were to read just one of those outlets consistently, you would not hear the voice of the other ones. And people try to represent each other, but it's just fundamentally different than reading directly from people across, in this illustration, the political aisle. Yeah. And I don't know, you actively curate it. And that's a place where, again, I actually have physical subscriptions that come in, and physical newspapers too, because feedback from the ones that curate online have a tendency to gravitate too narrowly, whereas the print layouts still surprise you with what an editor or they'll throw in a poetry or just random things all over the place that will continue to sort of knock you out of your comfort zone and knock you into places you didn't even know to go looking to read. And that's the key part to try to land into.
I love that.
That's so true. And I just agree. So yeah, David, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom and insight. This has been fantastic. Can't say thank you enough.
Yeah, it's good. It's good catching up. And next time we'll have to do it over cocktails.
There we go. It's been an absolute pleasure, gents. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our shiny craniums.
Okay. That we haven't seen the sun for 3 days here.
I know, but we are
you're thinking optimistically.
So hard from the work that we're putting into this. It's the glistening of the sweat that's maybe just from my cranium. I don't know.
I'll play. I'll go for a sweaty cranium that's shining, glistening.
That's what I should have said. It was a glistening cranium.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
That
you go. Or
no one-
forehead, or yeah.
Who could not love a glistening cranium?
I think a lot of people would
Can you
not
just imagine the
love.
line outside if we say glistening craniums inside? There'll be a line. People will be like, "Yeah, give me. I want some of that action."
All right, Tim. So let's get off of glistening craniums and on to our conversation with David. So what were some of the things that caught your attention?
Testing in the real world.
Testing in the real world.
This is your new theme song. Now I'm gonna be testing in the real world. Or maybe it's a ballad. I was testing in the real world. No, I don't know. Okay.
I wasn't going there, but anyway, there we go. Testing in the real world. Tell me about it.
Okay, so I love this idea that when David says, everybody's for it, but then that everybody breaks down to very specific people. You have to get everybody involved. And so it's not just 12 departments, it's 12 different people who each have to talk to 12 different people in their departments.
Yes.
You've got to get all this buy-off. And this is one of the big challenges, and we've talked to other podcast guests about this, about how difficult it is to get something done. And part of it is selling it into the organization.
It isn't so much getting it done in the digital world like we talked about, where it's relatively easy to put, hey, here's test A, B, even C, D, E, F. You can do that. You can actually automate that.
Yeah.
In many of these real world components, and David even talked about this even a little bit from the digital component, you have to have so many different people touch it, and it impacts so many different things that has real world implications that just make it hard.
Which is, and those are good conversations to have, right?
They're very good conversations.
That not any one of us is going to have all the right ideas and and take into consideration all of the elements and environmentals and social and individual contexts that need to be taken into place. We need to have those conversations.
We need to have them.
But it takes time and energy to do that.
And sometimes you run into barriers and you have to get through those barriers or around those barriers and various different pieces. And so all of that comes into play when you're trying to do experimentation in the real world and make something so that you're actually getting a deeper understanding of what it is that you're researching and looking at the performance of a tax letter or the performance of body cameras on a police force. You have to actually apply that research and test that in the real world, because otherwise you just make these assumptions and you can look at things and you can make very wrong assumptions if you don't have a control and you don't have some way of measuring this relative to the other components around there.
And even when you do, even when David has conducted, when he was at the lab at DC, the largest police body cam study ever with the best randomness, the most rigorous setup, it might not apply to every single city.
Yeah.
Not every mayor in every town could just go, oh, that's great, I'm going to do that.
Well, and that gets back into the replication component that we've talked about multiple times. Small nuances can make major changes in how a experiment or the actual component works within an organization.
Right. So if you have a police force that has been through years of training, like Washington D.C.'s, so they've got higher sensitivity, but it's still a very large police force with a very large population compared to a town of maybe 15 or 20,000 people, where there's 2 or 3 police officers that know everyone in the community and have more, for lack of a better word, intimate relationships with the community. How you use police cams in that environment is going to be dramatically different than how you use it in a place like DC.
Well, and even going and Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we are, right? Big metropolitan area, it's going to have different impacts. You can't take the findings. You can use the findings from DC as information to help guide where you're going, and it is
So
a piece of information.
It's a principle,
It's a principle, or it's a data point.
a data point that you can use.
But you have unique circumstances. We have a whole different police force, different demographics, different cultural components, different
right.
history with how our police force works with the city and works with the community. So you can't just say, all right, let's take these findings and now let's just plop them on over here and expect to get the exact same results.
Which is actually really central to the argument that we need to do testing.
Yes.
That we need to keep vigilant about testing and trying different things so that we can understand how those principles apply in our community, in our corporation, in our department, however whatever we're really looking to improve. Team building in general works great. Mm-hmm. How do you apply it? Is it applied the same way in every organization? Kurt, you've done hundreds of corporate team building.
Hundreds.
And you've used a common set of tools, but they didn't play out the same way in every organization.
They by far didn't play out in the same way. And some of that has to deal with the components that were brought in because of the corporation that was there.
In terms of what they were sort of
The
filtering for?
the culture that they had, the environment, the situation that they were in. Were they in a good situation, bad situation, indifferent? Had they just gone through layoffs? Are they growing?
yeah.
Are they doing various different things? But then part of it is just other outside factors, as Annie Duke would say, almost luck. What's the weather like? Mm-hmm. Is this after lunch, or is it before lunch? Is it after dinner where drinks are being served? Is it other? All of those factors go into the exact same team exercise that we could be doing and getting a very different result.
So when you're leading those, have you found yourself changing the way you address them?
Oh, yes.
And the way you set them up and the way you lead people through them?
Oh, definitely. You have to modify your approach based on a number of factors. And sometimes it's really easy to figure that out. Sometimes you're going, this organization has just gone through layoffs. They are in a fearful state. These people are probably having some survivor guilt. They're probably not happy with the organization. They're feeling, unloved. Their trust level is way down.
The regulatory fit is much more on the prevention side than on the promotion side.
Right.
Yeah.
Very easy to figure that out and to say, all right, we need to adapt to that situation and modify how we approach this, maybe even modify some of the activities that you do. But there are many times where you're talking with a company, seems they're going, it's just kind of a normal company, nothing really spectacular, various different things. And the very next week you have another company, normal company, doing normal things. And they're very different outcomes and very different situations. And so
there's a lot of context that is beneath the surface that we don't see,
that we're not aware of. I love that thought about being beneath the surface, because I do think that there's that element where we don't necessarily know all of the things that are going on. And so that's where I always say, at least for the team building component, there's an art and a science to it. And part of that art is being able to be in the moment. Mm-hmm. And respond to what's going on in the moment. And I think we don't, in organizations, that's something that gets lost sometimes, right? Is that we try to do a program or an implementation of something, and if it doesn't work, we go, it's not working. And, there's an art to this, and saying, so how do we shift this? It goes back to Sarita when we were talking with her about, the component.
All the tweaks that she made.
Don't just give up.
Tweaks,
Don't just give up. Tweak. So one thing on David's police study that I loved, right? Best laid plans. No, we can't do it. Oh, wait, we don't have enough money. So the only way we can roll this out is we roll it out, kind of stepwise. Well, why don't we do that in a randomized component?
Let's just have each officer pick a coin, flip a coin.
I mean, it was, it's amazing that you you can plan for all of these things, but sometimes you just have to hop on opportunities when they arrive and say, yeah, it wasn't going to work if we planned it, but wow, we have an opportunity now to do it. Anyway.
Okay, so what was your big takeaway from our stunning and wonderful conversation with David?
Rats.
Was it because of Elise?
Okay, there is part of that. My daughter had just actually asked for a rat right before that.
And what did you say, Dad?
What did I say? What did I?
I think you said, "We'll see.
We'll think about it."
We'll
right?
think about it."
Yeah.
Which and what does that mean?
Means no. It means no way in hell.
But David said that rats are much nicer than mice.
Yes,
because
he
mice are
did.
biters.
Mice are biters. Rats aren't.
Yeah.
I know. I understand. Maybe we should have a rat, but we have a cat, and it's just a rat. I don't know.
Okay. But you like the rat study?
Well, I liked it because again, it was one of those components where the application that he talked about. The findings were great, but then how do you apply it? And the application, it was basically almost a failed study to a degree.
Yeah.
And
because the approach that they were taking was incorrect or not optimal.
Not optimal. And the more that we can learn to say learn to learn from these components and not just make these generalizations that we have based on what worked in this situation, that situation, as we talk about context matters.
Amen.
And our approach matters. And so I think those are the important things.
David also drew some attention to something that's really important, that the rigor, that the big challenge in developing these studies isn't the execution. It's plenty of things to be challenged with in the execution. The big challenge is deciding how you're going to study something.
Right.
Right. That being really clear on the goals and how you're going to understand these principles, that is a big damn deal. And I've seen that myself with my own work. I won't get into that. But.
So
Okay.
if you had to just highlight a couple tips from this conversation, what would you say? What would be some tips?
I'm going to go back to David's tips. Just start with something.
Okay.
Just start.
Anything.
Just do something. Right. That would be my number one thing.
It's so hard. Sometimes we get stuck in our status quo. We get stuck in the way things are.
Yeah.
It's going to be too hard. It's going to be whatever. So just start.
I go back to this friend of mine who works in a small university call center, like 6 people, small group, and he's just a guy answering the phone. But he thinks that everybody's in a bad mood because right now the technology they're using, when the phone rings, it's a huge ring over a loudspeaker so that everybody within like a block can hear this damn phone ringing. And his hypothesis is we all get a little nervous about that and we aren't providing the optimal customer service experience for the people on the phone. How do I go about that? And he's like, he doesn't have any money. This isn't going to be a $100,000 budget thing. He's got 6 people. And all he wants to do is convince his boss that, that we got to turn this big blaring sound off. I said, well, just start. Just start with, just find out if you can turn it off.
Yeah.
Just find out if the technology exists to actually just turn it off. Let's just start with the base. Is it possible? And if it's possible, then you can go to the next step. Like, okay, well, let's see what would happen if we had a shift without it and then a shift with it.
Yeah. Just start.
Just start.
Just start on your weight loss. Just start on your exercise. Just start on learning that new language. Just start on being a better person. All right.
You should start on that right away, by the way.
Just start on drinking, and then you'll be... No, I did not say that.
I'm starting on that right away.
We already started, if you haven't figured that out.
Okay, what was your top tip?
So, no, but I mean, we'll go back to, again, some of David's, right? Understanding the underlying problem.
Yeah.
We often look at surface components, and we take those surface elements as being the real problem when the real problem is something much deeper.
Right.
So again, you look at in an organization and you're looking at, all right, wow, we missed our mark on the sales components, right? The surface element is the incentives must be wrong. And in reality, it has nothing to do with the incentives. They're motivated, right? They're doing everything else, but there is probably some organization, maybe product, whatever, or vice versa, right? It could be like, oh, well, we have the wrong product or the wrong marketing, and it might be the incentives. Look beyond that.
Or the initial complaint is, we don't understand.
Yeah.
So it must be a communication thing, when it might not be communication at all.
Right. It's peeling back the layers,
Yeah.
right? And making sure that you're getting to that core problem as opposed to just the surface problems. So
Before we started recording this, we were talking a little bit about music.
we were.
And you had an interesting idea.
I did?
Yeah, yes, you did.
That was 2 beers ago. What do you expect me to remember? No, we were talking about our, some really, those lines within songs that just capture our imagination and make a statement that are just so, I don't even know how to describe them. For instance, you tell the line that you like.
So I'm going to start with, like a bridge over troubled waters.
Yeah.
I will lay me down. What does that mean? What does that mean? What I know is that it strikes me in the heart with a javelin. Like a bridge over troubled waters, I will lay me down. Like, wow, I am so there. But if I were to write what that means, I'd have to write a 10,000 word essay. or
my favorite,
yes, give one of yours.
Suck My Kiss.
Suck my kiss. No,
Red Hot Chili Peppers, for those of you who don't know.
You could suck other things and be extremely explicit.
But what does that mean? Is that good? Is it bad? Is it,
Yeah.
you can imagine what that is. It evokes an emotion.
Does it matter if it's good or bad?
I don't know. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's not this solid component. It is this thing that has a meaning for somebody that could be vastly different than me, and that's not wrong, right?
Yeah.
There's no right answer for the meaning of that. Same thing, a bridge over troubled water, right?
Yeah. Or Sting wrote in a song. He said, "Never to be wrong, never to make promises that break, like singing in the wind, or writing on the surface of a lake."
Writing on the surface of a lake. Just the visual image of that. But also, what does he know?
He could have said, "Wow, that zoomed by," but writing on the surface of the lake hits me at a level that is so different from "Wow, that zoomed by," or "We went lightning fast," or "That was really short-lived." All kind of saying something similar. But again, if I were to write an essay on writing on the surface of the lake, it would be a 10,000 word essay.
And
wow.
It's amazing, though. But they hit you much differently than the more, simple, straightforward component.
Yes, very much so. I love that. And that's what I love about songwriters.
Well, and that's
their ability to put these things into practice.
Into practice and to align that with melody and rhythm and everything
yes.
else that comes with it.
Of course.
That then evokes an emotional response. And that's the beauty of music.
Yeah. All you need is love wouldn't work so well if you said, all you need is love, or all you need is love. It's just, it works because of the rhythm of saying, all you need is love. Mm. It is literally how we would say it. That line gets reproduced in the song exactly as how it comes out of our mouth. All you need is love. It's not all you need is love, or all you need is love. It's all you need is love.
I thought it was all you need is love.
Yeah,
dun, 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 dun. It is. All you need is. You don't ever want me singing with you. All right.
Okay, but with that,
we need to sign off.
We need to say thank you. And just as a quick reminder, if anyone would like to share this, because all the cool kids are doing it, sharing it with one person who they think so highly of.
And remember, you are finishing your drive into work, and so when you get to work, you will share this.
Yes.
With one person. All right.
Yeah. Thank you to all.
Thank you for listening.